So I tend towards camp sometimes in my academic doings, mostly because I'm not actually in the academy anymore at this point. So I gave this presentation a somewhat melodramatic title, which is the battle for the soul of China avant-garde. And what I'm going to be talking about today is an exhibition that's, if my presentation will ever open, is an exhibition that's really, I mean, if you want to think about art history as being in any way event-based, the kind of defining event of the Chinese 80s, and if not of contemporary Chinese art in general. And this is an exhibition that's known in English as China Avant-Garde, with a slanted slash between the two words, the A and the G capitalized, and a hyphen between them. And in Chinese as the 中国现代艺术大展, a translation that's, of course, not accurate at all, but we'll get to that in a moment. And I don't have a elaborate slideshow, but rather just a few images that kind of go with the sections of this talk. And this is actually a report on this show from the China Daily that I'm just putting here because, you know, one of the basic misconceptions and misconstructions of this show and what it was is that it was a politically rebellious act that somehow happened completely outside the known confines of the system. And I sort of have, you know, this is the beginning of a much larger project, but I'm kind of been thinking a lot over the last couple of years about how to reposition this in a different kind of way. So this is not a talk about the China Avant-Garde exhibition, which opened on February 5th, 1989, in the building now known as the National Art Museum of China. It is not an account of how that exhibition was quote-unquote shut down a few hours after it opened on account of a gunshot fired by a female graduate of the Zhejiang Academy, Xiao Lu, at her graduation piece Dialogue, a performance undertaken in consultation with, or some have said at the urging of, her boyfriend at the time, the artist Tang Song. It will not explain how the gun in question was procured by a 17-year-old student at the Kafa High School, the Central Academy of Fine Arts High School, and grandson of one of the PRC's founding fathers, Li Songsong, nor will it speculate as to how this artist, then in the making, would later go on to build a career based on misty-eyed, impastoed paintings of scenes from the history to which he is a rightful heir, images which are actually more elegiac than critical. It will certainly not retrace the common move of positing that shot, Lexington-like, as the shot heard round the world in the ultimately aborted revolutionary sequence of the student movements which followed only a few months later, nor will it assert that this temporal primacy somehow marks contemporary art as an avant-garde space, which it claims to be. And it will not ask what is perhaps the most interesting question of all to pose about this show, one that resonates particularly in light of last year's brief mishap by the management of Art Basel in attempting to move the dates of Art HK up to February, which is why on earth did the exhibition of the decade choose to open on Chinese New Year's Eve? And why weren't these artists home with their families? And more pressing yet, how did they ever find installation workers and security guards who were still working and still in Beijing? That probably has to do with demographic transitions that have happened since 1989, but okay, sorry, a little installation humor. Okay, okay. It is instead a simple meditation and hopefully the start of a larger investigation into how this exhibition has functioned in terms more abstract than concrete, to define the range of possible positions with which the nascent world of quote-unquote contemporary Chinese art, then still yet to have even settled on this designation, you know, there were many other terms in play, would articulate and receive the possibilities open to it. Indeed, seen from a narratological or a discursive analytic perspective, it seems that here, for the first time, we see an art world present in China in the original Dantovian sense of overlapping complex systems of relations that contextualize and condition the work contained therein. Because our time here is brief, I wanted to look at this exhibition through the prism of 6 modalities, each of which has in its own way proved recursive and resistant in the 2.5 decades which have followed. And the first of those is what I'm just calling Anticlimax. Any analysis of China avant-garde needs to begin with the basic fact that it was not what it was later asserted to be. In other words, that the art movements which it sought to recapitulate had actually run their course years earlier in the actual new wave of 1985 and 1986. A movement that culminated with the famed Zhuhai Symposium, which certain critics in Beijing have been attempting to reposition in this framework of quote-unquote little movements lately, but that's for another conversation. The Zhuhai Symposium, which had the official title as christened by the Wuhong Anthology of Chinese Contemporary Primary Documents, the Grand Slideshow and Symposium on the Art Trends of '85, which was held in August of '86 at the Zhuhai Painting Institute. Many here know that the original plan of holding this exhibition at the Agricultural Exhibition Center on the East Third Ring Road in July 1987 under the title Young Artists Academic Exchange Exhibition, which has this great Chinese title. It's like 各地青年艺术家交流展 or something like that, was thwarted by the anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign, which unfolded in earnest during early 1987. Meanwhile, art, still united by the last vestiges of a unified dialectic in China, had moved on from the freewheeling experiments of '85 and '86. Think the Pool Society in Hangzhou, or those crazy Xiamen Dada guys burning up their paintings down in Fujian, and onto a more analytical mode of purifying language. When the planning for the exhibition began in earnest with the Huangshan meeting of October 1988, there was already the sense that its protagonists and organizers, who were essentially the same people who had put together the proceedings 2 years earlier in 1986, were out of sync with the developments of the intervening 2 years. Parenthetically, it is this disconnect which Zhang Peili and Geng Jianyi addressed in the works they realized specifically for that meeting, namely Zhang's interminable video 30 by 30, in which he reassembles the pieces of a broken mirror for an hour, or Robin knows the exact length, and Geng's deadpan questionnaire and certificate project, where he asked all the participants to fill in basic information about themselves and then gave everyone a proof that you'd completed the questionnaire. In any case, the point to be made here is the schizophrenic nature of the prime position the exhibition has occupied in all accounts since. The defining event of a decade was strangely, sadly, a few years behind the times. A less authentic afterthought to a forestalled idealistic project. And it is this notion of delayed realization and of a final result that does not coincide exactly with a founding impulse that I think belies many moments in recent art history in China, from the belated arrival of biennials and triennials around the country to the formation of a consistent and sometimes coherent market for contemporary work, and onto the recent surge of institution building, mostly of the private variety. Which brings me to my second modality, struggle. In an essay written just a few months after the exhibition, which is brilliantly titled Confessions of a China Avant-Garde Curator, Li Xianting has described the exhibition's quote-unquote awkward predicament as such. He said, with no way of realizing an avant-garde spirit, the only significance remaining for the exhibition was to confront society. Li was referring to what Li Xianting, along with Gao Minglu, were the two main curators of the exhibition. It was a collective of about 5, but they're sort of the two poles of the organization. And Li Santing was referring to what he perceived as the necessity of redefining the stakes of the show away from the internal struggles of the art scene proper, with its ongoing debates about the relative validity and legitimacy of competing styles, and moving it onto the terrain of the social realm into which the exhibition fell, which was Chinese and particular Beijing society in the late 80s. And whether it is this conception of a unified avant-garde sensibility defined in resistance to the backward tastes of the general public, or a more internalized idea of the contemporary artists, whom, we must not forget, were and largely still are the produce of the elite official academies, finding a way to win for themselves the same sort of acclaim that was historically the province of the official system. And we have to remember that there's a case for seeing this as a consequence of a certain mentality of struggle. The key idea here is that these artists and curators were, in fact, despite their progressive pretenses, creatures of the historical moment in which they were raised, an earlier period during which political struggle was the defining mode of social relations. And in this reading, they are seen as dupes, haplessly recapitulating the situation they were supposedly seeking to overturn by embracing the flawed logic of struggle, or fundo, as people would call it. And this fundamental urge is in turn taken as somehow reflective of an overdetermined situation whereby no real change would ever be possible. This notion of, and furthermore, this notion of confronting versus accommodating the overarching situation is one that has only gained relevance as an analytical construct in recent years, and particularly in our moment today of Zheng Fanzhi as bizarre men's cover boy, juxtaposed with Ai Weiwei's continued provocation and persecution, and the foundation of things like the official Academy of Contemporary Art, which happened in 2009. To exist or to push beyond, this remains to this day the defining binary of the contemporary Chinese art world, which is tied to the next of my little ideas here, which is compromise. Through and through, China avant-garde has been haunted by its single fundamental compromise, which was a prohibition on performance art. This was a concession made by the organizers in order to secure the use of the venue, which I'll talk about in a minute. For some, it loomed as unforgivable, while for others, it proved a productive limitation. Still others worked around it, concocting stratagems and strategies to sneak performance into this larger structure. The artist Wu Shanjuan, for example, whose idea was to sell shrimp, reducing himself to the status of a mere merchant. The concept here was, he said to one of the critics, you wrote articles which made me famous. Now you have the chance to buy my shrimp. He realized his performance by working just beyond the gates of the museum. And the aforementioned Xiaolu and Tang Song concealed the gun at the heart of their performance until the very moment of the gunshot. Other performances existed more purely as concepts, like Huang Yongping's elaborate plan to tear down the museum, which is actually what this is, by affixing a series of ropes to its facade, which was eventually shown in the exhibition as what some would call an unrealized project, basically with this sculpture of ropes and certain diagrams of the proposed plan to attach these ropes to the facade and thus demolish the museum. What is important, sorry, I just read that sentence. No, I didn't. What is important here is not the actual strictures by which this prohibition was enacted. A prohibition, it should be mentioned, that would reappear in January 2001 in the wake of the semi-public outcry over the next generation of artists, the post-sensibility artists who were, making basement shows with lots of dead animals and human body parts. But rather the parameters of the conversation that it set, one in which art institutions implemented and artists went on to overturn certain boundaries. The exhibition, which proceeded, as many at the NAMAC still do today, on the terms of a sanctioned rental, was shaped in the prolonged negotiations that preceded it and ran through it. a process still well known at the more experimental fringes of today's commercially articulated mainland scene. The next idea is that of the internationalism of this exhibition. You're laughing because that's in my show in Beijing. While China avant-garde is often thought through in relation to the student movements that followed it, for artistic purposes, it's actually more significantly seen in relation to another happening of the spring of 1989, the epic and epical exhibition Magicien de la Terre, which opened in Paris on, amazingly, May 21st, 1989, which was the exact day that the students moved into the square to face the official commemorations for deceased Premier Hu Yaobang, which is what marked the sort of acceleration and ultimate climax of the movement. Indeed, the three artists from China who participated in this latter exhibition at the Pompidou Center had all shown in China avant-garde: Huang Yongping, Yang Jieqiang, and as you see here, Gu Dexin. These plastic pieces by Gu, which you can actually see on view if you happen to find yourself in Beijing before May 27th, shameless plug, at the UCCA, were realized for China avant-garde. And actually, he started making them in 1983, but wasn't able to show them in his first solo show, which was in 1986, because they were not comprehensible yet. But what's very interesting to me here is the idea that this group of works was shown at China Avant-Garde, and just 8 weeks later, another group of similar pieces was shown at the Pompidou, which, I mean, if we go back to what Cosmin was just mentioning about this kind of the inherent contemporaneity of, or whatever, I forget what you called it, but the kind of like the precondition of simultaneity as the condition of possibility of contemporary art in general. I mean, this is like maybe the first work in China that you could actually impose that kind of a reading onto. I mean, of course, it wasn't exactly the same piece. The piece in Paris was created on site and actually destroyed at the end of the exhibition, but it was the same material and it was really the same concept. So it's interesting to think about how this came to be. And of course, these three artists who showed at Magicien de la Terre were all chosen by one of the members of the China Avant-Garde Curatorial Collective, who was chosen to join the group specifically for his international experience, a guy by the name of Fei Dawei, who was actually my predecessor by 2 at UCCA, who had spent the year of 1986, 1987 on an exchange program in Paris. And indeed, it was Fei who gave the exhibition its English, or should we say French name, or partially French name, which, as I mentioned, is inconsistent with the Chinese title. And I'm not really one to talk because the magazine I founded has 2 completely different titles in English and Chinese. But the idea was that, like, China avant-garde was a conceptual translation of the large Chinese exhibition of modern art, which would be the literal translation. And an international important audience was an important, albeit secondary, goal of the organizers. And Fei embarked on what definitely stands as the first international PR campaign of the Chinese contemporary art world, earnestly sending letters and telexes to the state system, French curators he had spent the previous year courting. And indeed, there were pickups like this one in Time magazine with its fantastic headline. And this was, I mean, what was interesting here is that this is paradoxically the point, the exact point, I mean, 'cause this is the point at which the sort of Western mainstream coverage of Chinese contemporary art actually falls completely out of line with the real story and action. So one thing that I'm always amazed at is that when the Stars exhibition happened in 1979, there was Fox Butterfield on the front page of the Times like 5 days later with a story that actually stands up pretty well discursively, like kind of explaining what the stakes were, how they tied into larger movements, what the sorts of strategies they were employing, and what the final consequences and upshots were. And more or less, I mean, there weren't many huge international news developments in the 80s coming from the Chinese art world, but when this rolled around, I mean, of course, this is a few months before Tiananmen, so there's still a different kind of mode of talking about China prevailing in the West. After this great divergence happens, where of course like specialized art media attention to what's happening in China expands rapidly as it becomes circulated on the international market. But I mean, if you read the mainstream papers today on contemporary art in China, it's always just completely appalling. I mean, there was a story a few weeks ago with the headline like contemporary sculptors using ancient, what was it? Do you remember that story? I mean, it was unbelievable. That it kind of, really basic dichotomies between like modernity and ancient traditions, and sorts of strategies that are actually much less advanced than what was being used then. So I'm sort of, as a sideline, quite interested in how these two conversations fell so far out of line. And particularly relevant for our purposes here, at a moment when much of recent art history is being reevaluated as pivoting on the year 1989, like the giant exhibition last summer at the ZKM that Belting put together. Is the temporal coincidence or overdetermination in which the Chinese 80s effectively end just weeks before the global 1990s begin, which is what happens with Magicien de la Terre. Okay. The next notion is that of sanction, basically the approval that is conferred by an exhibition, which is, of course, like a pretty basic thing throughout the art world. But I just wanted to share here a little reflection from Li Xianting, who's the guy all the way on the right there, and then the sunglasses is Gao Minglu. The others have kind of all disappeared. But this was as close as I could find as to a picture of the actual group of curators altogether. So Li Xianting wrote that, actually, throughout the entire exhibition, I couldn't bear to watch the commanding attitude that a few critics on the committee held over the artists. They treated the exhibition as if it were a gift to be graciously bestowed on the artists, as if they were presenting them with the opportunity to enter history. Which is too super overdetermined if you know about an exhibition that happened in Beijing just 2 years ago with the name, what was it called? Reshaping History? Yes, curated by a guy called Liu Peng, which is essentially a pay for inclusion exhibition, which pretended to be a comprehensive summary of the previous 10 years. In any case, Li continues, thus a few of these critics were flustered and frustrated at the mischievous performances carried out during the exhibition. They were simply too focused on the exhibition as a historical activity. So essentially, here's the arrival of the, it actually predates the moment of the visiting biennial curator setting up shop to have the artist come and see the doctor, which is something that we'll notice in the video that I've chosen, which actually comes from 1996 by Zhou Tiehai, which is sort of from a completely different period, but I thought resonated with this moment in a nice way. And the point here is simply that this kind of curatorial collective, which established very strict procedures by which it would vet and select the work that would ultimately be shown, is essentially attempting to put into place exactly the kind of system that it's supposedly rebelling against. And then also, which was kind of what I was actually going to talk about in the first place, but decided against, the idea that this collective, which consists of these two gentlemen here, then also Fei Dawei, Fan Dian, and Ho Han Ru, in some way actually comprehensively represents the entire range of possibilities open to people who kind of came out of this specific moment. I mean, if you know these names, it makes sense. So today even the fundamental polarity is between a kind of more Li Xianting-like reading of this as an actual dialectical process and of art as an agent of social change, and a more Gao Minglu kind of theoretical or potentially even pseudo-theoretical notion of an avant-garde as like a mental and a spiritual force for enlightenment. But then the sort of supporting roles, the younger guys, Fei Dawei, who I've just mentioned, Ho Han Ru, who of course goes on to become, sort of the first Chinese face on the international biennial scene, and then Fan Dian, who's today the director of the National Art Museum of China. So that basically, at this moment, the parameters are essentially set for, the coming 25 years. And I just wanted to end by, this is a shot from the the commemoration. This is an exhibition that happened on the 20th anniversary of the show, which was of course shut down like 20 minutes into it, which was of course what everyone wanted to happen anyway. And there they all are. You can see Xu Bing with his glasses in the back there. In any case, and it's actually at the Agricultural Exhibition Center and not at the Namlock for kind of exactly the opposite political reasons. But so, of course, history is about elision. I mean, that's what it means to write history. But it is interesting to just reflect, in lieu of a conclusion here, on why certain myths linger. For example, in the specialist circle, we understand that actually the exhibition opened on the 5th. The gunshot happened. It was closed for 2 days. It reopened on the 8th. It ran through the 14th. It closed on the 15th, 16th, and 17th because of what is still recorded, even in the MoMA anthology, as a bomb threat that turned out to be a false alarm, which is a performance by an artist called Liu Wenping, who, like, in response, who was actually completely in cahoots with Tang Song, whose dispute with Xiaolu over the authorship of the gunshot piece is a whole other story that some people try to treat as this great kind of feminist struggle, but really is just, a disaster. That this performance was actually so completely connected to the first one. It was like the gunshot followed by the bomb threat. Is entirely written out of the history, is very, very interesting. I mean, basically what the guy did was cut out newspaper letters and make like a ransom note like you would see, in some segment of like Christian Marclay's The Clock, like Hollywood caricature kind of thing, and mailed it to the Public Security Bureau, to the museum, and to the Culture Bureau. And this was enough to get the exhibition, re-shut down. And actually what they were reacting to the whole time, and what the gunshot was about everyone's disgruntlement over the fact that Li Xianting had decided to put all the paintings in the main gallery. Of course, these are exactly the paintings that you'd see at any Sotheby's preview these days. Wang Guangyi, Zhang Xiaogang, and the rest of F4. And that shooting one's own work was actually the way to bring attention to actually, it's an act of institutional critique, essentially, or it was a gesture of discontentment with the show itself. And the idea of the artist shooting her own work as opposed to her boyfriend shooting it was to eliminate as much as possible the kind of extrinsic elements from the action and reframe it completely as an incident that would disturb the flow of the exhibition. In any case, that's not really what gets talked about. And instead, we're left with this rather simplistic idea that, it opened and was shut down, which, of course, feeds right back into everything we like to think about how art works in China, which is probably the main way that most people who aren't sitting in an afternoon like this think about art in China. So anyway, I don't have any real, contribution to human knowledge here, but these are just things I've been thinking about. And I mean, from an event perspective, it still remains, we all still live in the shadow of this temporary exhibition that happened during what would now be the Chinese New Year holidays, back when we were all really young. So, thank you.
Does anybody have an urgent question? We can do one question now, like before. I mean, we can do more in the discussion, but after all these, you have nothing to ask about it? Like, you all know about this kind of things? I think I will make a little note about, what Phil was talking about. Like with a lot of curators, Chinese curators who are still kind of active in the circle, especially in the institutions in the Chinese art circle now. I think when you talk about battle for the soul, it's like they're fighting for the 话语权thing, right? This word appears at every symposium in China, and also like in some, like art writers things. Like 话语权 is more like, how do you say that? Like discursive, right?
I mean, it's like discursive authority, which is much loftier sounding than what it actually, how it actually functions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like they when they mention about this, it's not really about like any like Foucault like theories or like whatever theories. It's more like about who has the right to talk about the only narrative in histories. Actually, like this is why I think this phenomenon like is why we have this topic today, like writing not even recent but urgent history. This is like I think in China, like I think from Lu Peng's Weibo, which is the Chinese Twitter, he was talking about he's writing the history of the past art history of the past 10 years or something. If I didn't like misunderstand it. So like this very urgent like thing of like putting things and shut them into historical narrative is a very common practice in China like now. And I think it's kind of like, I won't say that it's like a communist residue, but like the stubborn obsession about progress. Like progress, like we have been, we have enough discussion or like enough narratives about the thing, like the art that we're having at present, and we have to put it into history and we move to other things. I think it's a little bit like that. So it's like more like Hunjin was talking about contemporary, and it feels like the contemporary art in China is shutting down the present. You have everything that you're on the same temporal platform. You see them in the museum, you see them in whatever, and then you just put them back in the history textbooks. I think this is kind of like the course that we would like to look at, like, through history today. So do anybody have any questions or whatever?
I was in a symposium, the Beijing Art Academy, what is Central Academy?
Oh yeah, I was there. Yeah,
Oh
I
yeah.
remember that. Yeah.
So there's a dean of the school.
Yeah.
He was making an amazing theory about the
Yeah.
China avant-garde theory.
Yeah.
And also the Gao Mingnu was bring the minimal, maximizing or minimizing theory, theoretizing to the Chinese avant-garde. But I think it's it's interesting to bring the Japanese and Korean theoretizing, historical theoretizing in 70s, 80s in terms of this abstract painting. And also same, the very similar approaches to theoretize their own abstract painting as something as very kind of Asian or also Korean or Japanese, but also very Chinese, initiating abstract painting as Chinese avant-garde. And it has a sort of kind of a common example existing in Korea and Japan also in 70s, 80s. And it's always there, like a Korea versus Western abstract painting, or Japanese versus Western abstract painting, and China versus Western abstract painting. It's somehow emerging like that. And it might be interesting to compare how this theoretizing, it has a kind of absurd situation in these three countries, in their like what is Korean abstract painting and Japanese or Chinese as a name of avant-garde or the progressive form. But I think it's maybe better interesting to compare in these three countries this theoretizing agenda. This is my kind of quick idea, like after listening.
Yeah, no, I think it's. There's a very interesting comparative history to be written. The only thing I'd say is that it does also seem like the story of the 80s was much less about that, in China at least, was much less about that kind of a comparative discourse between, say, China and the West than it was really about the reemergence, the problematic reemergence or emergence of a humanist sensibility. That was like a word that got used quite a lot. And that, I don't know, maybe the defining thing was just this, it really was this nationally networked kind of, it was a discourse network of progression from one style to another, often a few in the course of a year. It was at China speed, and it was, things became problematic sort of only in retrospect. So it's, I don't know, I think compared with this more reasoned approach in these other contexts, it was often quite a lot about this struggle and about this basically contest to attain authority over what was going on. So, but it's very interesting. So.